They found the first lantern in 1947, buried 3 feet beneath what used to be the Holloway family barn. It wasn't lit. It hadn't been lit in decades. But when they pulled it from the dirt, still caked in clay and root fiber, there was something inside. Not oil, not a wick, something else. The sheriff's report called it organic matter of unknown origin. The coroner, a man named Eugene Bartlett, who'd seen his share of death in rural Kentucky, refused to write what he actually saw. He quit 2 weeks later, moved to Ohio, never spoke about Briar Hollow again. Briar Hollow, Kentucky, population 311 in 1890, population 89 in 1920, population 0 by 1955. It wasn't disease that emptied it. It wasn't economic collapse. It was something the families who lived there called the signaling, a phrase that appears in 7 separate diaries, in letters to relatives who burned them immediately, in one surviving testimony given to a priest who later hung himself in his own rectory. The signaling, no one explained what it meant. No one had to, because if you were from Briar Hollow, you already knew. The lanterns appeared first in the autumn of 1891. Families would wake to find them hanging from their fence posts, their porch rails, the low branches of trees that overhung their yards. No one hung them there, no one admitted to it, but every morning there they were, unlit, waiting. At first the families took them down, threw them into the woods, smashed them with hammers. It didn't matter. By dawn, new ones appeared, always in the same places, always facing the house. And then, on October 14, 1891, they lit themselves, not with fire, with something cold, a greenish glow that pulsed like breath, like a heartbeat slowed to the edge of stopping. The families stood in their doorways and watched the lanterns burn without heat, without smoke, without sound. And that's when they heard it. Not with their ears. Deeper than that, a rhythm, a pattern, a message no one sent, delivered in a language no one spoke, but that every single person in Briar Hollow somehow understood. They were being called. The first to answer the call was a man named Thomas Greer. He was 41 years old, father of 3, owned 18 acres of tobacco land on the eastern edge of the hollow. His wife, Margaret, woke at 2 in the morning to find him standing in the yard, barefoot, his nightshirt soaked through with dew. He was staring at the lantern hanging from their gate. It was glowing, pulsing, and Thomas was breathing in time with it. She called his name. He didn't turn. She grabbed his arm. His skin was cold. Not cool, cold, like meat pulled from a cellar. She screamed for their oldest son, Jacob, who came running with a rifle he didn't know how to use. Together they dragged Thomas back inside. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He just kept staring toward the window, toward the place where the lantern hung, his lips moving silently, forming words that had no sound. By morning he was dead, no wounds, no fever, no explanation. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, but Margaret knew better. She'd seen his eyes in those final hours. He wasn't dying, he was leaving. And whatever had called him had taken something with it when it left. 3 days later, it was Samuel Cord, then Elizabeth Morvan, then 2 of the Parkhurst children, found in their beds, holding hands, their faces serene, their bodies empty. Within 2 weeks, 11 people were dead. All of them had been seen standing near the lanterns in the hours before. All of them had that same look, distant, obedient, gone. The town held a meeting. 70 people crammed into the church, and for 3 hours they argued, prayed, accused one another of witchcraft, of poison, of conspiracy. But beneath the shouting, there was a truth none of them wanted to name. The lanterns weren't killing them. They were taking volunteers. And the worst part, the part that made grown men weep into their hands and women rock silently in the pews, was this: some of them wanted to go, because the signal wasn't just a call, it was a promise. Those who heard it described the same thing, an overwhelming sense of peace, of purpose, of finally understanding what they were meant for. The lanterns weren't threatening them. They were offering something, and that's what made it so unbearable. It wasn't fear that killed Briar Hollow. It was temptation. By December, families began to leave, packed wagons in the dead of night and fled without saying goodbye. They didn't talk about where they were going. They just went. And those who stayed, those who couldn't leave, or wouldn't, or were too proud to admit what was happening, they began to change. There's a letter in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, written in January of 1892 by a woman named Clara Dennison. She was 19 years old. The letter was addressed to her sister in Louisville, but it was never sent. It was found 40 years later, tucked inside the wall of a collapsed house, wrapped in a cloth that had been soaked in something the restoration team couldn't identify. The letter is 3 pages long. The handwriting deteriorates as it goes. By the 3rd page, the words barely hold together. But the message is clear. She wrote, "They are not ours anymore." Clara was talking about her parents. Her father, a stonemason named John, had stopped speaking on Christmas Eve. Just stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-breath, as if someone had reached inside him and pulled the words out. He would sit at the table, hands folded, eyes open, and stare at the wall for hours. Her mother rose, began walking. Every night the same route, out the door down the road, to the edge of the hollow where the tree line started. She would stand there until dawn, facing the dark, her arms at her sides, perfectly still. Clara would follow her, begging her to come back, and her mother would turn and look at her with eyes that didn't recognize her own daughter. Clara wrote, "She looks through me now, like I am glass, like I am not even there." Other families reported the same. Husbands who stopped eating, wives who stopped sleeping, children who would sit in the dirt and draw the same symbol over and over, a circle with lines radiating outward, like a lantern seen from above, like a star with too many points. No one taught them that symbol. They just knew it, the way you know your own name. The town constable, a man named Amos Harrell, tried to restore order. He gathered the remaining men and organized patrols. They would walk the hollow at night, armed with shotguns and torches, tearing down every lantern they found. But the lanterns always came back, and the men on patrol began to disappear. Not violently, not suddenly. They would just drift away from the group, one by one into the trees, following something no one else could see. By February, Amos was patrolling alone. On February 9, 1892, he wrote his final report. It's stored in the county records office in a file marked, "Discontinued Settlements." The report is 2 sentences long. The lanterns are not the cause. They are the response. No one knows what he meant. But 3 days later, Amos Harrell walked into the woods with a lantern in his hand. He was never seen again. By spring, there were less than 30 people left in Briar Hollow. They no longer tried to fight it. They no longer spoke of leaving. They had accepted something the rest of the world would never understand. They were being chosen, and whether that was a gift or a curse, they had stopped asking. In March of 1892, a circuit preacher named Reverend Silas Gant arrived in Briar Hollow. He'd heard rumors, whispers in the surrounding towns about a place where the devil had taken root, where families had been lost to some unnamed evil. Silas was a fire and brimstone man, the kind who believed that every darkness could be driven out with scripture and conviction. He came to save them. He lasted 6 days. His journal was recovered in 1959 during the demolition of what remained of the church. It had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the pulpit, wrapped in oilcloth, the pages stained with something that wasn't water. The first entries are confident, defiant. He describes arriving to a town that felt hollowed out, where people moved like shadows and spoke in whispers if they spoke at all. He writes about holding services where no one sang, where no one prayed aloud, where the congregation sat in silence and stared at him with expressions he described as patient. On the 3rd day, he saw the lanterns. He writes, "They hang like fruit from a poison tree. I tore down 12 before noon. By evening, there were 20. I do not know who places them. I do not know if it is human hands." On the 4th day, he began to hear it, the signal. He doesn't describe it as sound. He describes it as knowing, a certainty planted in his mind that didn't belong to him. He writes, "It tells me I am welcome. It tells me I am seen. It tells me I've been waiting my entire life to come home, and I do not know where home is." By the 5th day, his handwriting changes. The words become looser, frantic. He describes standing in the church at midnight alone, staring at a lantern that had appeared on the altar. He writes, "I wanted to smash it. I raised the Bible above my head, but my arms would not move. Because it was not threatening me, it was waiting for me. And God forgive me, I wanted to answer." The final entry is dated March 19, 1892. It's 1 sentence, written in letters so large they take up half the page. "They are not taking us. We are going willingly." Silas Gant was found 3 miles outside of Briar Hollow, kneeling in a creek bed, his hands submerged in the water, his eyes open, his body already cold. There was no lantern near him, but witnesses said his coat pocket was glowing. The people of Briar Hollow stopped burying their dead after that, not because they didn't care, but because the dead stopped staying in the ground. Families would lay a body to rest, pack the soil, say their goodbyes, and by morning, the grave would be open, empty, no signs of disturbance, just an absence, as if the earth itself had decided the body didn't belong there anymore. And in the weeks that followed, people began to see them, the ones who had answered the call, standing at the edge of the woods, walking the roads at night, not as corpses, not as ghosts, as something in between, still wearing the faces of the people they had been, still moving, still watching, but no longer human. By the summer of 1892, Briar Hollow had become something else entirely. It wasn't a town anymore, it was a waiting room. The 18 people who remained no longer farmed, no longer cooked, no longer maintained their homes. They simply existed in the spaces between days, moving through routines that had lost all meaning, watching the lanterns multiply like a slow, growing infection across every surface, every structure, every tree. A postal courier named Henry Bilks rode through in late June. He was delivering a letter to a family named the Crowells, A letter from their daughter in Ohio, begging them to leave, to come stay with her, to please, for the love of God, get out. Henry found the Crowell house empty. The letter still sits in the archives undelivered, stamped with a note that reads, "Addressee cannot be located." But Henry saw them. He saw all of them, standing in a field just past the church, arranged in a circle, facing inward, perfectly still. He counted 14 people, men, women, children. Their eyes were open. Their mouths were moving, but no sound came out. And in the center of the circle, suspended in the air at chest height, was a lantern. It wasn't hanging from anything. It was just there, glowing, pulsing. And as Henry watched, the people in the circle began to sway, not randomly, in unison, like grass in a wind that only they could feel. He didn't deliver the letter. He turned his horse and rode for 2 hours without stopping. That was the last recorded sighting of the living residents of Briar Hollow. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed? Would you have run? Or would you have listened to the signal and answered? By October of 1892, the state sent a marshal. His name was Clayton Voss, and his orders were to investigate reports of mass desertion, possible cult activity, and the complete breakdown of civil order. He brought 2 deputies and a county clerk to document whatever they found. They arrived on October 11th. They left on October 12th. The report they filed is 9 pages long, but 8 of those pages describe jurisdictional boundaries and legal definitions. The 9th page contains 1 paragraph. It reads, "No residence located. Structures intact but abandoned. Evidence of sustained habitation until recently. No signs of violence, no signs of struggle. Recommendation: condemn property, prohibit resettlement, classify as unsafe for human occupation." What the report doesn't mention, what was only revealed in a private letter Clayton Voss sent to his brother 3 weeks later, is what they found inside the church. Every pew had been removed, the floor had been torn up, and in the dirt beneath, someone had carved that symbol, the one the children had been drawing, the circle with radiating lines. But this one was massive, 15 feet across, carved deep into the earth, the edges smooth, as if shaped by something other than human tools. And in the center of the symbol, arranged in a perfect spiral, were the lanterns, 43 of them, all glowing, all pulsing in perfect synchronization, and though none of the men would admit it in writing, they all heard it, that rhythm, that knowing, that pull. Clayton ordered his men to destroy them. They smashed every single one, shattered the glass, bent the metal, scattered the pieces, and then they rode out of Briar Hollow and never went back. But Clayton's letter ends with a confession. He writes, "I have not slept since we left, because I can still hear it, and God help me, part of me wants to go back." Briar Hollow was officially decommissioned in 1896. The state seized the land under eminent domain, citing public health concerns and structural instability. The few remaining structures were left to rot. No salvage operations, no auctions, no attempts to repurpose the land. It was simply written off, erased from county development plans. Within a decade, most maps stopped listing it entirely. But the land didn't stay empty. In 1903, a logging company out of Lexington purchased the territory, unaware of its history. They sent a crew of 9 men to survey the timber value. The crew set up camp on what used to be the main road through town. They were supposed to radio back within 3 days. They never did. A search party found the camp 2 weeks later. The tents were still standing, supplies untouched, equipment neatly arranged, but the men were all 9 of them, vanished without a trace, except for one thing. Hanging from a tree at the center of camp was a lantern, unlit, rusted, identical to the ones described in the 1892 reports. The search party cut it down and brought it back as evidence. It was stored in an evidence locker in Harlan County for 16 years. In 1919, the locker was opened during a routine inventory. The lantern was gone, no record of it being removed. Just an empty space where it had been. The logging company abandoned the claim. The land reverted to state control. And for 30 years, no one went near it until 1941, when the war effort demanded timber, and the government didn't have the luxury of superstition. A federal crew was sent in with explicit orders: harvest the trees, ignore the stories, complete the job in 6 weeks. They brought engineers, surveyors, a medical officer, 23 men total. They were professionals, disciplined. They weren't going to be scared off by local folklore. The first week went fine. They cleared 2 acres, set up a mill, established a supply line. But on the 8th day, one of the workers, a man named Carl Dempsey, reported finding something strange. A clearing in the woods that wasn't on any of the maps, perfectly circular, 50 feet across. The ground inside was bare, no grass, no undergrowth, just dark soil, smooth and flat, as if it had been swept clean. And at the edge of the clearing, arranged in a ring, were stones. Smooth river stones, each one marked with that symbol, the circle, the radiating lines. Carl said the stones hadn't been there the day before. His supervisor said he must have missed them, but Carl insisted. He'd walked that exact path the previous afternoon. The clearing hadn't existed. 3 days later, Carl didn't show up for his shift. They found him at dawn, sitting in the center of that clearing, his back straight, his hands in his lap, staring at nothing. He didn't respond when they called his name, didn't react when they shook him. His eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing something else, somewhere else. They carried him back to camp. The medical officer examined him. No fever, no injuries, pulse steady, pupils reactive, but Carl wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't move unless someone physically guided him. He just sat and stared and breathed in a rhythm that one of the workers described as too slow, like he was only halfway here. On the 15th day, the lanterns returned, not all at once. One appeared on a tool shed, another on the edge of the mess tent. By the 3rd day, there were 11. The crew tore them down, burned them, buried the remains. It didn't matter. By morning, they were back, and this time they were glowing. The foreman shut down the operation, ordered an immediate evacuation. 22 men packed the trucks and left within 4 hours. Carl Dempsey was still sitting in the medical tent, staring, silent, unreachable. They loaded him into the back of a truck. Halfway down the mountain, he stood up, opened the tailgate, and stepped out while the vehicle was still moving. They found his body 3 hours later. He'd walked back into the woods, back toward Briar Hollow. He made it 2 miles before his heart stopped. The federal government condemned the land in 1943, declared it a protected wilderness area. No logging, no development, no public access. It remains that way today. In 1978, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky named Michael Prout wrote his thesis on abandoned settlements in Appalachia. Briar Hollow was one of his case studies. He spent 3 months combing through archives, tracking down descendants of the original families, piecing together a timeline that no one had bothered to complete. His thesis was 462 pages long. It was never published. The university's review board rejected it, citing lack of academic rigor and reliance on anecdotal evidence. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the appendix. Michael had included photographs, 23 of them, taken during an unauthorized visit to the site in September of 1978. He'd hiked in alone, carrying a camera, a notebook, and a map he'd reconstructed from century-old land surveys. He documented everything: the collapsed houses, the overgrown roads, the church, still standing, its walls leaning but intact. And in the final photograph, taken inside the church, he captured something the review board couldn't explain. The symbol was still there, carved into the dirt floor. But it wasn't empty anymore. In the center, arranged in that same spiral pattern, were lanterns. Dozens of them, some rusted, some new. Some that looked like they'd been there for 100 years, and some that looked like they'd been placed the day before. Michael's notes described standing in that church for 20 minutes, trying to rationalize what he was seeing, trying to convince himself it was a prank, a coincidence, some kind of historical preservation effort gone wrong. But he couldn't, because while he stood there, he heard it, that rhythm, that pulse, that signal, and he wrote, in handwriting that barely holds together across the page, "I understand now why they didn't leave. It's not asking, it's reminding. Like it knows something about you that you've forgotten. Like it's calling you back to a place you've never been." Michael Prout withdrew from the university 3 weeks later. His thesis advisor tried to contact him. His family filed a missing persons report. He was found 6 months later, living in a cabin in eastern Tennessee, 40 miles from Briar Hollow. He was alive, functional, but he wouldn't talk about his research, wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. When pressed, he would only say one thing: some places don't want to be forgotten, and some things don't stay buried just because you stop looking. The photographs were confiscated by the university. The thesis was archived but restricted from public access, and Michael Prout never wrote about Appalachia again. But the story doesn't end there, because people still go to Briar Hollow. Hikers who ignore the signs, curiosity seekers who've heard the stories, locals who think they're brave enough to see it for themselves. Most of them come back. Most of them leave with nothing more than an uneasy feeling, a sense that they were being watched, that the woods were too quiet, that the air felt wrong. But some of them don't come back. Not right away. They come back days later, weeks later, changed, quiet, distant. And when you ask them what they saw, they won't tell you. They'll just look at you with eyes that have seen something they can't unsay. And if you push them, if you demand an answer, they'll tell you the same thing every single one of them says. The lanterns are still there. And they're still glowing. There are no official records of disappearances tied to Briar Hollow after 1943. No police reports. No investigations. But if you talk to the people who live in the counties that border that land, they'll tell you stories about cousins who went hiking and came back different, About teenagers who snuck in on a dare and never spoke about it again. About hunters who swear they've seen lights in the woods at night, moving in patterns that don't make sense, pulsing in rhythms that feel too deliberate to be accidental. And if you ask them if you really push, they'll tell you the truth that no one wants to admit. Briar Hollow isn't abandoned. It's waiting. The families who answered the call in 1892 didn't die. They didn't leave. They went somewhere else, somewhere the lanterns were leading them. And that place, whatever it is still open, still calling, still sending signals no one sent. Because the lanterns were never the message, they were the invitation. And Briar Hollow was never a town that died. It was a doorway that never closed. Some doors are meant to stay shut, but this one keeps opening, and every time someone steps through, it gets a little bit wider. The question isn't whether Briar Hollow is still there. The question is whether you're the kind of person who can hear it calling. And if you are, God help you. Whether you'll be strong enough not to answer.